Welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be looking at some pretty cool research on sensorineural deafness in white Devon Rex cats. And specifically, I know a lot of our listeners are curious about the prevalence of this condition, particularly in relation to those really striking blue eyes we often see in the breed.
Right. And, we have a really fascinating research article from the Journal of Veterinary Internal Medicine to guide us through this.
Perfect. So we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of deafness and those beautiful blue eyes. What exactly were the researchers trying to find out?
Well, their main objective was to determine the prevalence of congenital sensorineural deafness, or CSD, in client-owned, purebred white Devon Rex cats. So they examined a group of 40 cats with a median age of 19 weeks at 2 different veterinary facilities over in Poland.
Okay, so we've got 40 white Devon Rex cats. I got it. How did the researchers go about figuring out which cats had hearing issues?
They used a technique called brainstem auditory evoked response testing, or BAER for short. It's a really cool way to objectively measure hearing ability by looking at brainwave activity in response to sound. This is super important with cats, especially because they can be really good at sort of masking hearing loss you might not know just by looking at them.
Yeah, cats are very sneaky, aren't they? So what did these BAER tests reveal about these Devon Rex?
Well, the results were really interesting. They found that 10% of the Devon Rex cats in the study actually had CSD.
Wow, 10%. That's 1 in 10. So if you're thinking about getting a Devon Rex, that's definitely something to keep in mind. And was this deafness only in one ear or both ears?
That's a great question, and interestingly enough, they found that unilateral and bilateral deafness occurred with equal frequency. So 5% were deaf in one ear and 5% were deaf in both.
Okay, so let's get down to it. Did they find a connection between those really beautiful blue eyes and deafness?
Well, in this particular study, they didn't find a statistically significant association between CSD and blue irises. However, we have to keep in mind that there are other studies out there that have suggested a possible link. So it's not a simple yes or no answer.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's a little more complicated than we initially thought. You mentioned earlier that some research suggests certain breeds might be more prone to CSD than others, which is something we also see in dogs. Can you elaborate a little on that?
Absolutely. So research suggests that breeds like Norwegian forest cats, for example, might have a much higher prevalence of CSD compared to the Devon Rexes in this study.
So that suggests there could be some underlying genetic variation contributing to breed-specific predispositions. That's fascinating. With that in mind, what are the implications for breeders, especially those focused on white Devon Rex cats?
Well, I think the study does highlight a positive step in the right direction. The Polish Felinological Federation, which is the organization that oversees cat breeding in Poland, now recommends BAER testing for all white cats intended for breeding.
Well, that's great to hear. It sounds like there's a growing awareness of CSD and hopefully, steps being taken to reduce its occurrence. Before we wrap up this section of our deep dive, I have to ask about that anecdote in the study where they mentioned that cleaning a cat's ears before the BAE test actually affected the results.
Yeah, that was a really interesting finding. The researchers observed that cleaning one cat's ears right before the test actually impacted the results. So even though the ears seemed dry, they think that just the presence of some residual moisture in the ear canal could interfere with the transmission of sound waves during the testing.
It's so interesting how those seemingly insignificant details could have a real impact on the results.
Absolutely. It just highlights the importance of standardized procedures, really paying attention to every detail when conducting these tests. Because everything from, the placement of the electrodes to even the environmental conditions, all of that can really influence the accuracy and the reliability of the results.
Okay, great. We've uncovered a lot of ground already. We've got a 1 in 10 chance of deafness, and the blue eyes thing is more complicated than we thought. What's the next step here?
Well, I think the next step is to delve a little deeper into the methodology of the study itself, and that will help us better understand how they actually arrived at these findings and maybe answer some more questions about the blue eyes connection and what else might be contributing to deafness in these cats.
Awesome. Sounds good. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and do just that.
Welcome back. Now, before we jump into, what else might be at play here, beside blue eyes, let's kind of unpack how the researchers got to their findings. Understanding their methods, I think, gives us a much better perspective on what these results really mean.
Yeah, let's open up the toolbox and see what they were working with. So to assess the hearing, their main tool was, remind me again,
BAER testing, which stands for Brainstem Auditory Evoked Response. And it's a really cool technique because it goes beyond just, simple behavioral observation. It gives us a much more objective measurement of a cat's actual hearing ability.
Yeah, because like you said earlier, cats are very good at hiding things, right?
Mhm.
So just because they react to a sound doesn't necessarily mean their hearing is perfect. So how does this BA ear testing actually work? What's involved?
Well, it basically involves measuring the brainwave activity in response to sound stimuli, which are usually clicks delivered through headphones. And so by analyzing the patterns and the timing of these brainwaves, we can figure out whether or not the sound is traveling properly through the auditory pathways.
So they're basically sticking electrodes on these cats' heads and playing clicks. Is that what we're talking about?
Pretty much. The cats were given a mild sedative first just to make sure that they were relaxed and comfortable during the procedure. And then these tiny little electrodes were very carefully placed on their skin to pick up those brainwave signals.
I can imagine that would be a bit of a challenge with the Devon Rex, even if they are sedated. They're pretty wiggly little creatures. Did they say how they managed that?
Yeah, they definitely followed some pretty strict procedures, both for the accuracy of the measurements, but also obviously for the well-being of the cats. Accurate electrode placement is super important for getting reliable results. You don't want to be messing around with that.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that they use clicks as the stimuli. Are we talking like a metronome, or what exactly do these clicks sound like?
It's more like a really brief, really sharp sound delivered directly to the cat's ears, again through headphones. And these clicks are designed to produce a very specific pattern of brainwave activity that allows us to analyze, how well the auditory pathways are working, how intact they are.
So it's not about whether the cat consciously registers the click, but it's how their brain is responding to it on a neurological level.
That's really cool. So how do they then take these brainwave patterns and actually determine, okay, this cat is deaf or this cat has normal hearing? Right. So in cats that have normal hearing, the Bayes test will show a series of kind of like predictable peaks and valleys in the brainwave response. And that indicates that the sound is traveling effectively through those auditory pathways from the ear all the way to the brain.
So it's like a little roadmap of the sound's journey through the brain. I like that. So what happens if a cat has sensorineural deafness? What does that brainwave pattern look like then?
That's where things get interesting. So in cats with sensorineural deafness, those characteristic peaks and valleys that we see in a normal hearing cat, those will either be absent or they'll be significantly altered. So that tells us that there's something disrupting, the sound signal somewhere along that pathway. Either it's not reaching the brain properly or it's not being processed correctly.
So essentially, by comparing those brainwave patterns of, cats with normal hearing to those with suspected deafness, they can pinpoint, okay, these cats definitely have CSD. And then based on the pattern, they can even determine if that deafness is in one ear or both ears. Is that right?
Exactly. And once they had all of that information, then they could start to look at, okay, how common is this condition in this population of Devon Rexes? And then they could start to explore those potential relationships with, other factors like blue eyes.
Okay, so they figured out who's deaf and who's not. But how did they actually measure, the blue eyes? Did they just categorize the cats by eye color, or was there more to it?
No, they went a little deeper than that. They actually documented the iris color of each cat, noting whether they had two blue eyes, one blue eye, or no blue eyes at all. And that allowed them to compare the occurrence of CSD, across those different eye color groups and look for any kind of statistically meaningful relationships.
And as we talked about earlier, they didn't find a super strong connection in this particular group of Devon Rex. Which leads to even more questions, of course.
Yeah.
But before we get there, I want to go back to that interesting finding about the cat whose ears were cleaned before the test. Remind me what happened there and why that was so significant.
Sure. So they found that this one cat that had its ears cleaned right before the BAEOR test, it showed a weaker brainwave response, and there was also a longer delay in the response compared to the results they got after the ears had completely dried.
So even something seemingly as, insignificant as a little bit of moisture in the ear canal can actually throw off the results. That's wild.
I know. It's incredible. And it really, again, it highlights how important it is to have those standardized procedures, and pay really close attention to even the smallest details when you're conducting these tests. Because, like I said, everything matters, from how you place the electrodes to the actual room temperature. It can all impact the outcome.
Okay, we've gotten really deep into the methodology here, which is great. But now I'm really curious to hear your take on, what does all this mean for breeders, for owners? We've got this 1 in 10 chance of deafness. The blue eyes connection, isn't as straightforward as we thought. What's the big takeaway here?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is really just awareness. Even though the prevalence of CSD in this specific group of Devon Rexes was lower than we've seen in some past studies, it's still something that breeders and owners really need to be aware of and be thinking about proactively.
So what does that look like, in practice? What can they actually do?
Well, for breeders, I think it means seriously considering Bay ER testing for any white cats that they plan to breed.
Yeah.
Early detection is really, it's so powerful because it allows them to make more informed choices and potentially, reduce the risk of CSD in future generations of cats.
And what about for owners?
Yeah.
If I have a Devon Rex, what should I be doing?
Well, being aware of CSD means, really paying attention to your cat's behavior. Are there any signs of hearing difficulties, especially if they're a white cat? And again, that early detection is key. Because if you catch it early, you can make adjustments to their environment, to how you interact with them, and ultimately ensure that they're safe and well cared for.
Yeah, that's such an important point. That it's not just about identifying the problem, it's also about understanding how to, provide the best care for your cat. Okay, now I'm really dying to know, what are some of the other factors that might be at play here besides those blue eyes?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that definitely deserves a deeper look. So let's dive into those possibilities after a quick break.
All right, so we're back, and we're ready to dig into those other possible factors that could be contributing to CSD in these Devon Rex. I'm really fascinated by this idea that, it might not just be about the blue eyes.
Yeah, definitely. This study didn't show a super strong connection between the two in this particular group, so it really does make you wonder what else is going on here.
Right. If it's not just the blue eyes, then what else could be in the mix? What are some of the other suspects we should be looking at?
But one thought is that there could be other genes involved, genes that aren't directly related to eye color, but still play a role in how those inner ear structures actually develop.
So it could be a much more complex genetic picture than we initially thought.
Yeah.
Like multiple genes have to line up just right for normal hearing to develop.
Exactly. And it's not just about the genes either. We can't forget about all the environmental factors that might be influencing things, especially during those early stages of development.
Oh, right. Like, could exposure to certain toxins or infections during pregnancy potentially affect the kitten's hearing?
Yeah.
It's wild to think that those early experiences can have such long-lasting effects.
Absolutely. And remember that interesting case from the study, the cat that had its ears cleaned right before the test. It really shows you how sensitive the whole auditory system is and how even something seemingly minor can disrupt things.
When you think about all the different factors that could potentially go wrong during development, it's amazing that any cat ends up with perfect hearing. But seriously, with so many possibilities, how can we even begin to unravel this mystery?
Well, that's the crux of the matter, isn't it? And I think the answer boils down to more research. We need those big, comprehensive studies, studies that look at a wide range of cats to really help us separate out the genetic factors from the environmental ones.
So each new study is like adding another piece to the puzzle, and eventually we'll get the whole picture. It's really cool. So for our listeners out there, especially those who are, big fans of Devon Rex, what's the key message they should take away from all of this?
Well, first and foremost, I think awareness is still really important. Even though the blue eyes connection isn't as clear-cut as we once thought, CSD is still a real concern, especially in these white-coated cats.
So whether you're a breeder or an owner, being proactive about testing and just generally being aware of any potential signs of hearing loss in your cat, that's really key, right? Early detection is so crucial.
Exactly. And, I think it's important to remember that we shouldn't overreact to the findings of just one study. This whole area of research is still developing, and there's a lot that we're still learning. So it's a good reminder to always be, open-minded and to look at the bigger picture.
This has been an absolutely fascinating deep dive into the world of sensorineural deafness in white Devon Rex cats. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing all of your insights. I know I've definitely learned a lot.
Well, thank you for having me. Exploring these topics and understanding more about how to keep our feline friends healthy, that's what it's all about.
And for our listeners, if you want to explore this topic even further, we'll have a link to the full research article in our show notes. And as always, from Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.